Great. Tom, would you like to make the introductions?
Hello, everyone. This is Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons who are with us here on Zoom. And we thank them because they make these meetings possible. Welcome to our viewers on YouTube, if that's been done. And today we have with us Jonathan Schorsch. He is professor in Jewish, religious, and electoral history at the University of Potsdam, near Berlin in Germany. He has written some eye-catching books like Swimming the Christian Atlantic about Judeoconversos, Afroiberians, and Amerindians in the 17th century. Perhaps his best known book is Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World. And with his colleague Sina Rauschenbach, he co-edited the Sephardic Atlantic, Colonial Histories. And today he will talk about the little known expedition to the Dutch Wild Coast. The Dutch Sephardic Jews left Brazil in 1654. And 10 years later, they were all over the place, all over the Americas. And one little episode in that fateful 10 years is a trip to Pomeroon by Jeosua, Nunez, Netto, and Joseph Pereira. And Jonathan will talk about the ins and outs and the meaning of this trip. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Tom, David. What a pleasure, an honor. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. I can see at least one person from Curacao, and it's a pleasure. I look forward to seeing all your faces later when I stop sharing my screen, and we can have some questions and hopefully even some answers at the end. So I am going to talk today about this, to me, very fascinating episode in Sephardic history, Sephardic colonization of the Americas in 1658. I see here my title is actually a different one because this is from an older talk, an older version of this, but we'll be going over the same material. And what I'm really focusing on is a 4-page report, this relation, this relasao, that was sent from this colony, and I'll talk a little bit more about the colony and give you many more details. It was a 4-page Portuguese report that I believe was sent in order to help drum up additional settlers, additional Sephardic and perhaps other Jewish settlers to this new colony. I stumbled across the document a few years ago and found it quite fascinating. While many people and scholars have known about the text, and it was translated already by Meyer, Joseph Meyer, I think Joseph is his first name, in the 50s already, very few people have actually analyzed the document. And one of the things that I find important about the document is that it's one of the only first-person accounts from this whole era of Sephardic colonization. In other words, we have a lot of data, we have a lot of documents, but we have very few first-person accounts. And so it's a real kind of window into the mentalite, the outlook, the attitudes of the actual people involved. So let me make sure that I can move there we go. So here is the first page of this document. And as you can see, it's in Portuguese. I think it's pretty obvious that it's in Portuguese because it was really aimed at Sephardic Jews back in Europe or in the Mediterranean, hoping that additional colonists or would-be colonists could be enticed to joining this settlement. I'll tell you the name of the settlement and much more in a few seconds. This report was printed in Amsterdam And according to Harmdin Burr, with whom I've communicated about this, he thinks I don't know who the printer is, but he thinks from the typeface and the images, the illustrations in it, he thinks that the equipment was actually the same equipment that had belonged to Menashe ben Israel. Menashe ben Israel died in 1657. So it was either one of his sons or one of the people to whom he sold the equipment, or to whom his son sold the equipment, some of whom were Christian. But I really have no idea exactly who printed this. But many things tell me and tell us that this report and the whole expedition, the whole attempt to settle in this colony, were part of this wave of Sephardic colonization efforts in the Americas in these times. Curacao was conquered by the Dutch only 20 or 30 years earlier, and the Sephardim already had moved there, and some of them had been granted charters to settle there a few years earlier. So this was part of a real concerted effort. So we're talking about a colony in what is northeast South America. It is a little bit north of Suriname, and I'll show you some better maps here, but this is just to give you a kind of general location from our contemporary perspective. And here is a map, I think it's from the 1770s or something like that, made by a Dutch cartographer. And you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but here's the Essequibo River. Can you see my cursor moving here? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you for your nods. That's helpful. And then the Pomeroon River, which is this smaller river here, and I'll show you a close-up of it, is where this actual colony was settled. If you have extremely good eyes, you can see that right here it says, and please forgive my Dutch pronunciation, Nieuw-Middelburg, New Middleburg. The colony as a whole was very short-lived. The Dutch had already come there earlier. I don't want to give you a whole background about the colony. It's just not worth it. But the Dutch had already built forts there as early as, I think, the 1590s. But they never really established a foothold there. And then when Dutch Brazil was put to an end by the Portuguese planters' rebellion in Brazil, and the Dutch were finally ousted in 1654, the Dutch were very keen on developing this for real, and so were the Sephardim, who now wanted to replace what they had lost in Brazil. The colony as a whole was called Nova Zealandia, New Zealand, and it was sponsored by 3 towns in Zeeland, Middelburg, Vlissing, and Ver. And again, I'm so sorry for my hopefully not so terrible Dutch pronunciation. I can read a little Dutch, but I never learned to speak Dutch because all the Dutch people know English so well, and they never let you speak Dutch if you have bad Dutch like I do. So anyway, this was one of several attempts by Sephardic Jews to establish outposts of what we might call their informal empire on the other side of the Atlantic. Here you have a little bit more of a close-up. The Essequibo River with its islands here, and what now called in English the Pomeroon River, or the Paroma River, which is a native name, obviously. And this is where the Dutch had control for several decades, lost it very quickly, and in fact, the colony as a whole, the Jewish colony as well, was destroyed by the English already in the 1660s. But we're talking about the very first years of the colony. This expedition, this report is from 1658. Some Sephardic Jews had already moved there in 1657, but this report details one particular ship's voyage across the Atlantic. Here we go, another close-up of the Pomeroon River, and here again, on the south side, here you see New Middleburg. And apparently the town, village, whatever we want to call it, was successful for a number of years. Settlers had definitely come. Farms, plantations were created, and as was true of so many of these colonies, they were very vulnerable, very fragile, and there were endless battles and wars between the different competing empires. And like many of these things, it was very short-lived. Just to give you some visual aid, right? This is what some kind of similar ship might have looked like at the time. Here are the islands at the mouth of this Essequibo River that you could see here in this map. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the relation itself, this document, and give you a little bit of background before I get into the text itself. So, as was true for a lot of these Sephardic colonization efforts, the Sephardim were very active players. They were very active participants. They entered into negotiations with the colonial authorities involved with this, with the authorities, back in the Netherlands, involved with this settlement of New Zealand, obviously not the New Zealand near Australia in the Pacific, but this was another attempt at building a New Zealand. And the Sephardim really responded to the call by the Dutch for colonists and for proposals for projects. And they came and they proposed a project, as was true in many, many other cases, in Suriname and Curacao and elsewhere. And the Sephardim approached these negotiations with some confidence. They had a very strong hand. They came with a great amount of experience. Many of the Sephardim involved with the negotiations were merchants. Some of them had lived in Brazil. They knew the Southern Atlantic. They knew colonial agriculture or tropical agriculture. So they were incredibly useful. In addition, despite the Dutch desire to develop this colony, their own calls for settlers was not particularly successful. As you might imagine, very few Europeans were interested in moving to a place that was riddled with insects and disease, was very far from civilization, that had none of the benefits or luxuries of European set towns or cities. And so the Sephardim were probably well aware of this, and again, were happy to take advantage of their strong position. So they entered negotiations, and as usual, it was a kind of a mutually agreeable effort. And as usual, the Sephardim received great benefits, right? Among the terms of the deal, as was typical for the time, the Sephardic settlers would get free land. They would get tax exemption for 5 years or 10 years, I forget exactly. They were given deals on buying slaves. If they bought 2 slaves, they would get another 2 slaves at a big discount. Et cetera, et cetera. So again, this was a kind of mutually agreeable, project. The Sephardim were benefiting the Dutch state and its development and colonization efforts, and the Dutch were giving good terms to the Sephardim. And because the Sephardim were so heavily involved with commerce, as many of you probably know, in the middle of the 17th century, at least 60% of the Sephardic men whose professions we know claimed to be merchants. So this informal Sephardic empire was really run on commerce and trade. And the Sephardim were very keen on developing outposts of trade, whether in Jamaica, Curacao, New Amsterdam, New Middelburg, and so on, precisely in order to have trading partners. So in other words, what was often the case was that the sons or the nephews of merchants would be shipped off to these far-flung outposts precisely in order to expand the family business. Right? This was an incredibly successful private network of family-run firms. And essentially, this informal Sephardic empire rested on these firms, depended on them, and benefited from them. So the negotiations were concluded, and this ship left in 1658. The two authors of the report, Joseph Pereira and Joshua Nunez Netto. Joseph Pereira, I don't know a whole lot about them, although Ton and his partner Michael Was helped me greatly finding many, many documents about them. But Joseph Pereira was a merchant. The ship on which they sailed, that is described in this voyage, a ship called Concordia, Concord, Harmony, Coexistence. That ship's name was quite popular at the time. It was actually in the motto of the Netherlands, that Concord, Harmony is one of the advantages of small states, of small nations. And it was a kind of quasi eschatological name as well, a very optimistic, hopeful name. And that optimism was shared across religious denominations, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews as well. So Pereira owned this boat, and he and Joshua Nunez Netto seem to have been among the leaders of this expedition. Although it's never mentioned in the report, we know that Pereira was actually given a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, by the Mahamad, by the Parnasim, the leaders of the Amsterdam Jewish community, the Amsterdam Sephardic community. And it was therefore obviously with the Mahamad's blessing, with the leadership's blessing, that they went to develop this colony that, as I said, had already existed for about a year, this particular settlement of New Middelburg. It's unclear to what degree the Amsterdam leadership was behind these settlement efforts. In other words, were they simply approving of them and supporting them, or were they in fact sponsoring them, or even were they in fact behind the whole plan? It's probable that Manasseh ben Israel was quite involved with this, and we'll maybe get back to that later. So the ship leaves, and what fascinates me is the travel report. As I said, this is really the only firsthand document of this sort that I have found from Sephardim in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century. And it really reads like any of the other travel reports that we see from Dutch authors, from Portuguese authors, although it is also different in its own way and very Jewish in its own way. As I said, it's obviously meant to excite others to come settle. It's obviously meant to advertise this new settlement. And what the report does is spend a lot of its 4 pages describing the voyage itself. And I find the descriptions of the voyage quite interesting and revealing. So we see, and if you're familiar with this literature of voyages, descriptions of voyages, of this kind of travel literature from this era, from these centuries, you will hear echoes, but also differences with the non-Jewish versions. So we learned that on the ship itself, the ship was kind of a traveling microcosm of Europe. There were Dutch soldiers on it. The captain was Dutch, but there were also French people. There were also, I think, possibly English people. The French people were likely Huguenot, right? The French Protestants who were very eager to get out of Catholic territories, and they preferred to live under Dutch Protestants than under the French Catholics. And then you have the Sephardim, and each nation on the ship had its own representatives. The captain seems to have chosen the representatives, although it's not exactly clear. It's not exactly clear why the particular people were chosen to be representatives. I suspect that it was due to their own experience in the Southern Atlantic, their own experience with sailing, their own experience with geography and even settlement. And likely it also might have been due to their elite status. And that's one of the things I'm trying to really figure out is exactly who they are. But as I suspect that, as usual, they are coming from merchant families. They may not themselves be the most prominent merchants, but they are the sons or nephews or cousins of prominent merchants. So each nation, including the Sephardic nation on this ship, had representatives. And we see throughout the voyage that the Sephardim are very assertive in giving the captain advice, right? We have a lot of episodes where the captain, they come across an island near the Canaries and they don't have enough water. And so the captain announces that they're going to go find local drinkable water. And the Sephardim are telling him, exactly how to do that, right? And, later on they get across the Atlantic and they insist you have to cross the Atlantic now. You can't wait because in the winter, in the summer, there are these although it's the winter in the south of the Atlantic, there are these periods of intense calm when there are no winds, and therefore travel is actually impossible, if not very, very difficult. So they know their stuff, right? And the authors of this relation make sure that the readers of the text know that the Sephardim know that they know their stuff, right? And I think this is a very intentional, perhaps it's an unconscious strategy of the authors. When they get to the other side of the Atlantic, we were told at one point, for instance, that they see all of this foam in the water. And they know that the foam is from the mouth of the Amazon River. So they know, here, we've made it. We're close to Brazil. The Sephardim complain about the captain's decisions. They criticize the captain's decisions about different things. I won't give you more examples. And at one point, many of them even are so annoyed with the captain's, what they see as the captain's bad decision-making, that they throw up their hands and they stop engaging in these conversations. Again, interestingly, on the ships, there is a relative degree of democracy, right? Even though the captain, of course, is the supreme commander and absolute ruler, and yet the captain continuously consults with the passengers on the ship, right? These are not ordinary tourists, obviously, right? Many of them, again, have experience. We know of one person on the ship, I don't know if it's a Sephardic man or not, who was a slave trader. And he was there, sent by the West India Company. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention that the whole settlement and this particular expedition was also sponsored by the Dutch West Indies Company, of course, not surprising. So the Sephardim, again, on the ship are very self-confident, they're very assertive, they know the details of travel, they know the weather, they know the climate, they know about navigation, and as I said, they make sure the readers know about it. There's also some interesting episodes, and by the way, sorry, they even tell us that on some issues, because they complain about the captain changing course. He keeps changing course, and they get very frustrated with this. And apparently even the women are involved with the conversations, which I also find fascinating. I'm not sure what exactly that indicates. And as always, I'm very open to your suggestions about any of these things. We're also told about a number of religious elements on the voyage. So for instance, there's a whole episode that takes place on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of the month of Av, famously one of the 4 major Jewish fast days. And on this day, the destruction of the temples, the 2 temples in Jerusalem, is commemorated and mourned. And what happens on this day is that there was a long period of no rainfall on the voyage. And as you know, drinking water was, the supplies were limited. They had to literally be carried in barrels. And so they always collected rainwater when they could. When the drinkable water went low, of course, that was an incredible danger. So on Tisha B'Av, of all days, when they're fasting and not eating and not drinking, it rains, and it rains beautifully, and they capture the rain. But the Sephardim won't drink it. They wait until after Tisha B'Av to drink it, of course, because they're good religious people. And the authors hint that maybe this rainfall is itself kind of a miracle sent by God. And they hint that in a way, maybe it's even a kind of reward for the passengers, the Sephardic passengers on the voyage who kept the fast day so scrupulously. And then we're also told toward the end of the voyage, when they finally arrive at their destination on the Pomeroon River in this Essequibo colony, and the colony was often called Essequibo, because of the major river there. The Sephardim won't get off the boat because it's Shabbat. And the captain is furious, and he orders their stove disassembled. Not that they could cook on Shabbat anyway, but he's trying to sort of punish them, but they won't get off the boat. And here too, I think this is a way that the authors are signaling to their readers, suggesting that the Sephardim are able to keep their religion. It's not a problem to be Jewish here. And even the Dutch authorities, even the captain, however reluctantly, tolerate Jewish difference. So again, I think the text is full of these signals to the readership. And there's also some other elements of the relation that fascinate me. So for instance, when they reach this colony, they haven't landed yet. They're trying to figure out which river is which, and they're trying to confirm from their maps where exactly they are by talking to local natives, local American Indians. And we're told at one point when the ship is anchored offshore that another ship approaches and comes next to it, alongside it, and then some people from that other ship board. And what is the other ship? It's a ship coming from Africa with 300 Arda slaves. And the authors of the report tell us that all of the passengers were cheered up by this. Why? And the authors say that the slavers, the people who are running the other boat, tell them that these slaves are good people, boa gente, boa gente. What here too, I think what is going on is, as I said before, right? These colonies depended on slave labor. They were absolutely impossible without the involuntary labor of what was called human property from Africa. Europeans, many of them did not want to engage in the very difficult, arduous labor themselves, and slaves were available if you had the money. So the Sephardim, in this sense, very much agreed with the Dutch colonizing authorities, who in one of the texts from the negotiations call these slaves, or any slaves, the sole salvation of the colony. In other words, they were absolutely essential. So the Sephardim, like all the other passengers on the ship, are cheered up because they say, aha, our labor force has arrived. We can feel a little bit reassured now. Things are falling into place. Good, right? So they land finally, and after Shabbat, right? And the governor of the colony comes on board the ship, and he gives them essentially a pep talk. Oh, what a wonderful colony. The agriculture is so promising. The climate is wonderful. You can grow anything you want. Anyone who comes here who's willing to work will do very well for him or herself. Welcome to the colony, something like that. And then the authors of the relation tell us that he turns to Jeosua Nunez Netto. He turns to one of the leaders of this Sephardic group, and he tells them, and you have to have a good sense of humor, I think, to deal with a lot of this stuff. But he tells them, let me just advance a little in my visual aids. He says to them, look at me, because the relation actually describes him as a fat man. He's amply endowed in terms of his stomach. And he turns to Jeosua Nunez Netto and he says, look at me. In other words, look at me. I'm very healthy, right? I have a lot of weight. And he says, this is sort of how, this is my response to living in this colony. In other words, you'll do well here. This is a place where you can grow fat. right? So the governor himself literally embodies the promise of the colony. And then the relation ends with a very long text. Here, this is the last page, and I can't go up, and I'm sure you can't read the Portuguese because it's small and it's faded. But it's an incredible homage to the colony. And here too, it echoes any number of these similar advertisements and travel reports from any of the colonizing powers, Dutch, French, English, Danish, etc. And it goes on and on for many, many lines about this new colony. It tells us that the authors met they met a Jew there who knows how to use Native American canoes. They met a Native American who speaks Spanish. In other words, this is a place where the settlers become native and the natives become civilized, right? And we can fit in, and it's a place of harmony and coexistence. The natives are friendly. The authors tell their readers the weather is perfect. You can go around without clothes even. That means the slaves don't have to be bought clothes. The slaves don't even need buildings and accommodations because the weather is so good. You can live a long life and you'll die of old age because the climate is so healthy, etc. Agriculture is amazing. You can grow all kinds of things, and they specifically reference the tobacco and the sugar, which is supposedly just as good as that grown in Brazil, right? There are no snakes here, there are no mosquitoes here, etc., etc. In other words, you have now arrived at a kind of a new Garden of Eden. Again, a typical trope from much of the European literature of this era, where when you arrive on the other side of the Atlantic, you find a kind of utopia, Thomas More's term, from exactly this period. A place that is really a return to the Garden of Eden. And you can live without the ills of civilization, and you can live in a kind of redeemed existence. And we're told in the very last lines that when these potential settlers might die here, their bodies will be buried here. And then the Messiah might come, when the Messiah might come down the road, and then we'll all end up in our homeland, right? May it happen quickly in our days, amen. So the way I understand the end of this text is, as you might expect for this kind of a document, they are really advertising in the commercial sense the qualities of this location. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that one of the things they say is that God saw fit to save all of these Sephardic settlers from a hell of snow. In other words, Northern Europe, where the weather was not exactly as balmy as it was in Brazil and Portugal. And thank God for that, right? We're going back to the weather we are familiar with and that we like. But essentially, this is an advertisement for the qualities of the colony, and you should all come. You'll do well, you'll make good money, life will be easy here, life will be good in the qualitative sense, right? But at the end, you see that the religious aspects of it, even though, as I mentioned, there are a few religious episodes on the ship itself, and they are, of course, used to show the faithfulness, the religiosity of the Sephardim on board. But you'll see here that in this document, at least, even though, as I just told you earlier, Joseph Pereira was given a Torah scroll to bring to this colony, and we know, of course, that the colony was intended, like all of these settlements, sorry, not the colony, but this Sephardic settlement was intended to be run religiously. And in fact, in the minutes of the negotiations, the Sephardim even insist they get the Dutch authorities to approve of their insistence that the new settlement will be run according to the Portuguese Nusach. In other words, even religiously, the Sephardim are making sure that they are controlling the culture of this new settlement, and it will not be run according to, let's say, Spanish Nusach. No, it will be Portuguese, right? Just like in Amsterdam and London, et cetera, et cetera. But note here that there is no messianism. If there's messianism, it's standard messianism. The colony is wonderful, it's beneficial. We may have freedom here, although that's never mentioned here. We will certainly have commercial success, but when the Messiah comes, it will be after our death here, and that will then lead us to the Holy Land in some unknown, unspecified future. So I know there's a very, very vociferous debate about the place of messianism in Sephardic colonization efforts. And while it's very true that messianism played a role in these efforts, especially after the episode of Shabtai Tzvi in the 1660s, but I would argue that here what we see is a much more standard Sephardic motivation, which is commerce and mercantilism. And just as you see in texts from Simon de Luzzatto, among others, his famous discourse on the state of the Jews from 1628, just as you see from Menashe ben Israel, many of these Jewish representatives across Europe were basically making the argument that Jews were good for the state precisely because of their commercial prowess and their commercial experience. And here, I think this is what we see here too. The motivation here is very worldly, very this worldly. So that's essentially the text of the relation itself. And now let me just talk a little bit more about some of the background, and then I'll end, and then give us a chance to have a conversation and for you to ask questions. So I show this Kabbalistic map here because there were many maps, of course, many beautiful maps made of the New World, and many of the maps of the New World, unlike some of the maps I showed you before, which were Dutch, a lot of these maps of the New World, including from Northern Europe, were mythical. They were cosmological. They weren't simply geographical. And we have to remember that there really was this split between, again, commerce and spiritual motivations, although often the two went hand in hand also. There's a very famous statement by one of the governors of Jamaica, an English governor of Jamaica, who says about the Dutch, he says, the Dutch believe in Jesus Christ, but they believe more in trade. And that was not just true of the Dutch, although it was particularly true of the Dutch. So again, things that are not stated in this text, but are part of the background of this text, have to do with some of the men involved. And I've been trying to figure out who they are. So Joseph Pereira likely was a family member, perhaps a distant cousin or relative of Abraham Pereira, one of the most prominent and wealthiest of the Sephardic merchants in Amsterdam. Pereira had spent time in France. It seems clear from the various evidence that Pereira and Nunez Netto knew each other from before this expedition, that they had possibly lived in Brazil, Nunez Netto in particular. Pereira clearly was wealthy enough to order a ship to be made for him, the very ship that they sailed on, a ship with a kind of interesting and a little bit unlucky history. It was captured by pirates twice, although he managed to get the ship back, although he lost all of his goods the first time. We know that a few years after their settlement in the colony, there was a falling out between one of the representatives on the ship, David Vaz, and Joseph Pereira, that they had a fight. We know that Pereira ended up back in Amsterdam, so he was not in the colony particularly long. And really, that's about it. I mean, I have had trouble really placing these figures, but it's also possible that Pereira himself was a scribe, He goes by the name of Joseph Israel Pereira, and there was a well-known scribe in the later half of the 17th century in Amsterdam named Joseph Israel Pereira, which would make sense if he was one of the authors of this text also. He had language skills and literary skills. But it's obvious that some of these figures were religious, right? They cared enough to bring a Sefer Torah. They had the support of the community back in Amsterdam. And this was really a kind of quasi-official report. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, the relation as a genre, the relações, right, as a genre, were almost always official reports. And so she asked me, my colleague, well, if this is an official report, who is it representing? And I think that's an excellent question, right? And that's why I would love to get closer to an answer. In other words, are these settlements an official policy of the leadership from Amsterdam, or is it kind of an informal policy that came from below? And I think there's evidence in both directions. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it. The last thing I'll say is to finish up talking about the document again. I find the text fascinating because what I see in it is a text that is very much a standard European genre from among colonizing powers. And yet it has a lot of Jewish particularities to it, right? We see the self-confidence of the Sephardim. We see their experience, right? We see the authors intentionally show the readers that the Sephardim are confident and have experience. And therefore, the readers are being told, we Sephardim have something to contribute to Dutch colonization efforts. We actually are players in this game. And that's important to know, right? Because again, it boosts their egos, right? And makes them feel good about themselves. We also see that the Sephardim really see themselves as equals. They are equals on this voyage. They give advice to the captain. They even see themselves as superior to the captain because they know more about navigation in many cases, or they think they do, than the captain. So it's an interesting glimpse into Sephardic kind of self-image. There's also a way I would argue that there's something somewhat post-colonial about the text. That is, this is obviously the era of colonialism and colonization. The Sephardim themselves are often seen, as Jews themselves are often seen in Europe at the time, as being an internally colonized group, right? Colonized in a different way than Blacks or Africans or Native Americans, but colonized in some sense nonetheless. And here what I would argue is this is a text that, again, a first-person text that is positing a kind of Sephardic post-colonial existence. If we come to the Americas, we come as settlers, we come as whites, we come as equals, and in some sense, therefore, we are no longer colonized. We have escaped from our internal colonization by Christians. Which I think is remarkable to see it laid out like this. So I think this is a rich and wonderful and revealing text in many ways. I hope I've conveyed a little bit of that to you. So thank you for your patience, for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Great, thank you very much. Can I ask how many copies of this document survive?
That is a great question. I do not know. I think I spoke to Harmden Burr about this, and he doesn't know either. I think I've seen references to one or two other copies, but I don't know. And I've even was told by the archivist at the Gemeentearchief in Amsterdam that the original copy has disappeared, which I'm actually quite upset about. And Harmden Burr doesn't know where it is. So I'm grateful that I have, we have this digitized copy, which by the way came, I stumbled across it because it's one of the many documents that was collected in a digitized collection of Sephardic documents that was put out by Brill, by the publisher in Leiden, Brill, although it was so expensive that my university couldn't afford it. And in the few days that I had access to it, I happened to see this title and I said, oh, wow, interesting. I wonder what this document is. So serendipity is, of course, always useful in scholarship. So yeah, David, a good question. Now, let me just look through the chat here. How much of Dutch map making was authored, funded by Sephardic merchants? Good question. So by the way, the negotiations and the agreement between the Dutch authorities in Middelburg and these Sephardic colonists, they were concluded with David Nassi, very well-known settler figure who ends up also he had already gotten a charter in Curacao. And I think he had also received a charter in Suriname, which is where he ended up. He did not end up going to the colony in New Middelburg. But Nassi was one of the people who commented on, or even wrote, according to some sources, one of the volumes of this famous Dutch atlases, Jansonius and Blau. Again, I'm sorry I don't really speak Dutch, so forgive my pronunciation. So Sephardim were very active in providing the information for the Dutch atlases. I don't know that they funded it, although I could just not be remembering it. Any dialogue about the Sephardic community being party to the slave trade? No, none whatsoever. I don't think I have not seen any word of criticism about trading slaves whatsoever, including from rabbis. Alas, in the 18th century, I start to see some, I wouldn't say opposition or criticism of the slave trade, but some sense of well, you have to treat the slaves right, you have to make them Jewish, and you know, that those kinds of things. But the issue of slavery is an enormous one, and yeah, let me just leave it at that. How were new Sephardic arrivals funded by the community to buy land, etc.? Good question. So we know that there were settlers who came to this colony from not only the Netherlands, and in fact, there were other ships that came. There were 35 families on this ship, apparently. There were other families that came. There were, I think, 3 other ships, including a ship that came from Saleh in Morocco. There were other settlers who came from Amsterdam, and the settlers from Amsterdam were funded by Teixeira, one of the big bankers in Hamburg. Sorry, the settlers from Hamburg were funded by Teixeira. I'm forgetting his first name, one of the prominent bankers there, and he funded it. And this was typical for the time because there were so many poor Sephardim, and the community leadership was embarrassed by them and also had to fund them and cover their expenses. Sephardic leadership was very eager to have them move on. And so Teixeira funded these settlers from Hamburg on the condition that they would not come back to Hamburg. And therefore, we know that they were very poor. And that was true of many poor individuals. They were sent over to the colonies, you know, let's get rid of them, let them go over there. They'll be useful over there, and then we don't have to lose money paying for them. Okay, so yes, the Spanish haughtiness, Spanish superiority, which I'm sorry to say, no offense to anyone here, that the Sephardim very much shared when it came to themselves. Francis Rifkin, Equity, yes. I assume Equity is not your last name?
Equity is my trade union.
That's what I thought. Okay, good. Yes, please.
I thought you got that. I use it for all sorts of chats, so I forgot to take it off. I wanted to know what the level of... I understood that they would bring slaves out of Africa and then marry them 10 years later. Is that the case?
That they themselves would marry them?
Yeah, well, I don't know who married them, but I understood that the slaves would be liberated and then would get married to people.
The slaves, in some cases in Suriname, there's a lot of evidence, and in some cases the slaves were manumitted or freed. In some cases they married even Sephardic Jews.
That's what I wondered, yes.
The response to it was often quite harsh by the leadership, and there was a lot of opposition by a lot of the leadership. It's a whole very long discussion. But I think what we have to remember is those marriages and those manumissions were by far the exception to the rule. They
Right.
were overwhelmingly rare. Why? Because manumissions were always an act of personal generosity. And
Right.
even people who liberated their slaves might liberate one or two slaves, and then they would still own, 70 others, 13 others, 85 others, or whatever, right? And we have to also keep in mind that many of these manumissions were not quite as beneficent as you might imagine. So often, I'm sorry to say, and this is true both for Sephardic owners and non-Sephardic owners, often women slaves were freed. Why? Because of as a reward for sexual favors, basically, and as a reward for being, as if they had a choice, being sexually available. Slaves were often liberated when they were old. Why? Because masters didn't want to feed them anymore, right? So again, like a lot of these things, it's much murkier than we might imagine. But it is true that in Suriname, for instance, and elsewhere in Amsterdam as well, a lot of these Sephardic merchants did indeed have, and the term itself comes from Suriname, what we call Surinamese marriages. In other words, they had unofficial romances. In some cases, the power dynamics are always unclear, but they had relationships with African women, and so in some cases married them, and in many cases had kids with them. In many cases, the kids were accepted into the Sephardic community with restrictions and with qualifications. So fascinating topic, but a large one.
Could I ask a bit further? Class. So, as you said, there were rich and poor Jews coming over. The poorer Jews were disposed of to the colonies, which sounds quite normal in terms of class. I think the British did the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But what sort of quite interests me is how those classes interacted and changed. Presumably, the working class did all the kind of skilled work and ploughing and stuff. The slaves must have done the ploughing.
I mean, again, this is an enormous topic. Yes,
Sorry.
no, don't be sorry. It's an excellent question. I'm just apologizing for my inability to give you an adequate answer. Talk about standing on one foot. So yes, first of all, it's all of the Europeans, and we have many examples from this kind of literature of the period. This was the reputation of coming to the Americas, that the poorest European could become his own or her own master or mistress and get out of the class strictures of old Europe, right? And that was part of the reason that many colonists indeed came to the Americas. And I'm sure it was just as true for Sephardic Jews. And poor Sephardic Jews might end up, because of the good terms of the Dutch, colonial authorities, or the English or the French, well, not the French, because they were Catholic and didn't want the Jews there. Many of them ended up buying plantations, although the Ashkenazim did not particularly get into the plantation economy. We also have examples of Sephardim who were, for instance, what you call them, the overseers on plantations. So I don't want to imply that the Sephardim did not work. Of course they worked, and I think while in some cases the Sephardic masters or owners might have sat around being fed and being well treated, I don't think that was the case. Certainly not at first. I mean, they were setting up these colonies from scratch. So I would put it more like the Sephardim probably worked very closely alongside their slaves. And I would like to hope that in certain cases, hopefully in many cases, they treated their slaves well, but I have not necessarily seen evidence of that. But yes, obviously, the slaves were human property. The slaves were treated as human property. And they were the ones who did the hard work of not only plowing, but harvesting the cane sugar, which is very, very difficult, boiling the cane sugar, which is very, very arduous process, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it's there. You see a lot of, as is typical of the Americas, you see a lot of social mobility. You see class falling to the wayside, and also you see divisions between Jews and non-Jews fall to the wayside in many cases.
Right.
In Suriname, for instance, and I have to imagine in this colony, insofar as it lasted for a few years, the Sephardim were really accepted as equal players. The Dutch got rid of all of the medieval anti-Jewish laws. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that the Jews were, of course, given freedom of religion in the new colony, freedom of worship. They were declared, they were even given what passed for citizenship at the time. There was no such thing as citizenship. But so, even the distance and the differences between non-Jews and Jews, particularly among the Sephardim, who saw themselves as very, very much loftier and better than the Ashkenazim. So the Americas helped also erode some of those divisions too. So very, very good questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bernard?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for a fascinating talk. In order to come to this, and I'm glad I did, I had to leave a talk being given at the Royal Academy of Spain in Madrid, the induction of Professor Paloma Diaz-Mas. And she is being inducted because of the work that she has done basically on 500 years of Sephardic literature, particularly scientific literature. And a lot of the examples that she gave during her induction speech were to do with things that would relate to navigation and instrument building and measuring and so on. Now, she was talking largely about the Sephardic communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, Turkey, Greece, and so on, although she started off quoting from some books from the archives and the libraries in Amsterdam. And I wondered to what extent there might have been interaction. You talked about the question of a knowledge of navigation, probably scientific instrumentation and so on. And I wondered whether there might have been interaction, whether people had come from the Eastern Mediterranean, but also about the role of science in the colonization process.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's tremendous Sephardic involvement in the sciences, going back to Avram Kreskas and the developers of the astrolabe and the cartographers of Majorca in the 14th century, 15th century. I don't think the Western Sephardim really needed the Eastern Sephardim in terms of this regard. I think they knew the Atlantic world much, much better firsthand. Right. There was, of course, a lot of literary and cultural interaction. A lot of the rabbis, Sephardic rabbis in Amsterdam, came from the East precisely because all of these Sephardim in Amsterdam were what Joseph Kaplan calls new Jews. So in terms of religious knowledge, absolutely, they depended on the East in many respects. But scientifically, I'm a little surprised. I mean, I may be misunderstanding what she was saying, but yeah, I think most of the science came from the Western Sephardim themselves. I mean, these were people who, for several generations, even as conversos, were heavily involved with commerce. And of course, to be involved with overseas commerce meant you had to know how to navigate. I mean, you could hire pilots and you could hire captains, but you still wanted to have control and mastery to some degree yourself, and many of them did develop that control and mastery. And by the way, I should say that one part of this essay that I didn't even mention because it would take us too far afield is that the text keeps repeating a term that the authors keep using to refer to people who know the land, experts, right? Bakianos. And I was wondering about this term. I had never heard this term, and like as I said, when they talk about the foam, from the mouth of the Amazon, they say, anyone who knows the land knows, aha, this is the mouth of the Amazon River, and they use this term, Bakianos, right? And I am convinced. I mean, this is the argument I want to make, and I've tried to do as much research into it as I could. That Bakiano is actually from the Hebrew term Baki. an expert, someone who's expert in something is a baki, and it's an old rabbinic term. So I even suspect, and I admit that this is completely speculative at this point, although I haven't seen anyone who disproves that, but I am convinced that even that sense of expertise in local or colonial, geography or social ecology or biology or whatever, that the term itself might derive from Hebrew, which would be very interesting. And it testifies to the fact that many of those involved, maybe not the conquistadores themselves, but many of those who were involved in this whole endeavor, commercial, geographical, navigational, agricultural, etc., many of them were conversos. Many of them were, the descendants of the Sephardim converted in the Middle Ages, which makes perfect sense. We know Jonathan Israel already tells us, for instance, this is a little bit of an aside, but that we know, and again, I'm sort of sorry to say this, it's not always so pleasant to know this, but look, I'm a scholar, so I have to follow truth where it leads. But we know that many of the slave traders in the 16th century were new Christians, to the point where they might have even kind of had a monopoly temporarily before all the other empires got involved. And Jonathan Israel tells us that there were no small number of conversos who fled from the Iberian Peninsula on slave ships. And that way they thought they could escape the Inquisition. They could get to the west coast of Africa, they could get to Brazil, they could get to Cartagena de las Indias, right? The slave ships were not only trading slaves, but they were, of course, also transporting people back and forth, So, we don't know. There's a level on which Sephardic involvement or converso involvement in commerce might have also been precisely about preserving a capacity for mobility, because that was, of course, so useful in case one needed to escape persecution. So, Bernard, yes, thank you. Excellent question.
Thank you.
David, you have a question?
Actually, yes, we just have a question on YouTube. I think it might be a bit generalist, but let's try. It's from Carol, and she says that Abraham S. Aquila created A.S. Aquila and brother, and David Israel Bravo started Bravo and Sons, which lasted for 3 to 4 generations. Can we discover when these companies were founded?
I'm sure we can. I don't know the answer.
Okay, no, fair enough. Can I have a related follow-up on that?
Of course, of course.
With this episode we're discussing, does it appear in either the community records, I don't know, maybe the Muhammad books, or indeed in the records of the West India Company? And then, of course, what happened to this colony?
It definitely appears, the giving of the Torah to Joseph Pereira and another man named David Cardoso, I think, is recorded in the minutes of the Mahmad, one of the many notebooks of the Mahmad. I'm sure there is discussion. Ton, this is probably a good question for you, and maybe this will be my follow-up request to you to look for this. I'm sure there are other mentions in the letters of the Mahmad, maybe, of letters back and forth from this colony. I haven't seen any, but I haven't had a chance to really look for it. The minutes of the negotiations between the Sephardic Jews involved and these Dutch authorities in Middelburg, I think are in the archives of either the National Archives in Den Haag or in the West India Company archives there. So yeah, this is the search now I have to continue with, to come up with different corroborating pieces of evidence. Yeah.
Yes, I think there's not very much in the minute books of the Mahmad directly. but
Yeah.
all of these people are mentioned at some point in these books.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few essays already written by, the first wave of historians who were so fond of Sephardic colonization, Oppenheimer. Arbel talks about this. So the whole episode is known. I assumed they scoured the archives. So there could be a few things that they didn't know about. I think what I feel like I've contributed, hopefully, or I will contribute because I haven't published this yet, is putting some of the pieces together. Figuring out more who the figures involved are, how they fit into this kind of socioeconomic picture of the Sephardim in Amsterdam, how it relates back to their connections with Portugal and Spain, and then I think also, as I said, a lot of the scholars have known about this text, but I haven't seen anyone really analyze it. And that's what I feel like I'm doing. And I think that's produced, I think, some fun results, giving kind of multi-dimensional entree to this. And, instead of just talk, often the historiography, the writing on a lot of these things can be very dry and sort of giving the facts, and what I'm trying to uncover is, well, what did they feel about it? What were their attitudes? What were their emotional involvements? Were they disappointed? Were they excited? Did they see this as a challenge? Did they see this as messianic? I'm just trying to understand their own understanding of what they were doing.
If the merchant families sort of knew what the conditions were in South America, would it be fair to deduce that this was aimed at poorer members of the community?
That is an excellent question. Maybe, I have not seen any mention of that in any primary document, but it's a good guess. I mean, in other words, what I hear you saying is they're part of the reason for setting up these things is to have a place to send the poor colonists to, which could be very likely. I do think, on the other hand, that we have to remember that a lot of the people involved as leaders were from the elite. Mm-hmm. So I think I would want to know more about who's coming to answer your question. But yeah, you could be right. It's a really nice idea. And I actually want to look into that now that you mention it. And someone just put in the chat, an excellent question. So one of about the cancellation of debts. So I don't think poor Sephardim had debts canceled. I could not be remembering it, but I don't remember seeing that. But however, there was a clause in the agreement with the Dutch colonizing authorities where the Sephardim pressed them to cancel all the debts that the Sephardim had either to the Portuguese government or the Spanish government, and all private debts from Brazil, which I think might refer to the Inquisition. So in other words, here too, we see the Sephardim playing their hand very strongly, right? They're saying, yeah, sure. We'll come help you out on the Wild Coast. I don't know if I said that. The area was called the Wild Coast by the Dutch. And so essentially the Sephardim are saying, yeah, sure. We'll come help out, but you have to do something for us too. And you have to cancel any debts we might have incurred while we were in Brazil. Again, I find that just fascinating. The Sephardim are good negotiators. I mean, and not only that, but they weren't just bluffing. I mean, they had good reason to feel like the Dutch would accede to their demands because they needed the Dutch. The Sephardim were really useful. And that was the term that they used in the 17th century. They were useful to have on your side.
Have you any idea how these sort of pamphlets were distributed? I mean, were they just sort of standing outside the Esnoga like some sort of nightclub promoters, just putting them in people's hands, or what was going on? Yeah,
it's an excellent question. I know that Oppenheim found, I don't know how he knows this. I'll have to go back and look at his essay, but he found, I think when you asked before about how many copies of this text there are, I think he found a copy in Livorno. or a copy sent to Livorno. So I don't really know if they were sent by private mail or if someone handed them out. That's an excellent question. Yeah, and again, I really, anyone who has any insights or ideas about any of this, please feel free to write to me or get in touch with me.
Thank you. Francis.
Yes,
Francis,
somebody mentioned colour. I'm quite white looking. All my Sephardi relatives who came from Egypt and came right through long centuries. I've got my passport and everything because it was such a clear descent. They were all brown. Middle Eastern brown, probably. Don't know really, but I was terribly jealous of them for being brown. I used to go off and get really suntanned in the summer because I wanted to be as brown as my relatives who were all bellowing in Arabic.
right.
And so there was a very kind of big, strong culture there of people who were not white. You wouldn't have called them white.
Well, in fact, maybe you could have written my first book for me or with me, because indeed that's one of the arguments I make. In the 17th century, there are many indications. I'm sorry, the sun is coming right down directly on me, and it's not an effort to get brown, although hopefully it has that result. In the 17th century, there are many indications that Northern Europeans saw the Portuguese-born as particularly swarthy.
Oh, really?
And we have if you look at my first book, and this is not a surreptitious sales pitch, although obviously if you buy it, I'll be happy, but you can also get it from the library. And I have a chapter on that called Inventing Jewish Whiteness. And we have a lot of mentions from English writers, Dutch writers, French writers, that they saw the Jews as a whole, but particularly the Sephardic, Portuguese-born as not quite white.
Right.
And that's a term from another scholar there's a whole field, by the way, called whiteness studies, but that the Jews were not quite white. And we do know that, as I said, there were certainly Sephardic merchants and others who married African women mostly. It was mostly men marrying African women. And there's some interesting cases. In fact, one of the people I want to write about now is a man named Moshe de Mesquita in 17th century Amsterdam, who was a mulatto, right? A half black, half white. His father had been a Portuguese merchant. His mother was an African woman. He himself had operated as a merchant in the west coast of Africa. By the way, there were a handful of communities in West Africa in the early 17th century where conversos lived, converso traders, and even open Jews traded there. The Inquisition was not happy about it. A lot of the intermediaries were themselves these mixed race children. And it makes sense. They knew both sides, right? They knew the languages and customs on both sides. So Moshe de Mesquita eventually goes back to Amsterdam, and he becomes a Parnas. He rises, talk about rags to riches, right? I don't know if he was rags. He might have started with riches because of his commercial birth and father, but he became one of the leaders of the Amsterdam community. Now, Ton, this is one of the people I want to get back to you about, because I really would love to find what I can about him. I would love to find out what happened to his children, were his children accepted, etc. So in some cases, we know that race was not an issue. Yet at the same time, again, I talk about this in my book, the Amsterdam Mahamad, including de Mesquita himself, issued takanot, issued ordinances forbidding the circumcision of Africans, forbidding discouraging the conversion of Africans, forbidding any Africans who were not married according to Jewish law, which meant, of course, most of them, from being buried in the cemetery at Ouderkerk. So again, as I said, we have always, with race and slavery, we have always a double movement. It's always an ambivalent phenomenon, right? We have, of course, many individuals moving toward the other, moving toward the blacks, moving toward the slaves in certain ways, sex, relationship, inclusion, what have you. At the same time, you also have the opposite, right? You have a movement of resistance, of opposition, of exclusion, of discrimination. And the Amsterdam Muhammad passed many, many ordinances, again, clearly aimed at excluding or making sure that Africans or descendants of Africans could only join the community if it was according to Jewish law, which meant essentially the bar was much, much higher. And indeed, I don't know if you know this, but in 1652, I think, the Muhammad also issued a ruling saying that not only Tedescos, right, German Jews, i.e. Ashkenazim, cannot study in the Eitz Chaim yeshiva of the Sephardim, but mulattoes also. In other words, mixed race people were no longer acceptable in the yeshiva of the Sephardim. There's many similar ordinances in Suriname. There's some also passed in Curacao. This is what, I wrote about a lot. So, and again, even though it's harsh from our perspective, it's not so pleasant, but it's important to know, it's part of the reality.
But the cultural difference, because my father was Ashkenazi, and they went to South Africa, and half of them became raging racists, and half of them became fighters for the African people. I went and saw them when I was 21. So you saw the extraordinary splits, divisions, and differences.
Yes. And one of the things I'm trying to understand, absolutely, as you said, one of the things I'm trying to understand is what led some people to one side versus the other.
Yes.
And I want to understand, does it have to do with class? Does it have to do with some kind of personal stance? I don't know. I don't have an answer yet, but I'm trying to get closer to one. And
I've got somebody you could interview probably.
Well, in some ways,
Not me.
I tell you the truth, it's much easier to deal with the 17th century because all the people involved are dead. And race, the whole question in terms of the 20th and 21st century is much, much more of a really touchy, sensitive topic for good reasons. But listen, I tell you, it doesn't matter. But someone just said in the chat, so did any of these mixed race people or even the Africans themselves get involved in the commerce, in the businesses, the family businesses? As far as I know, the answer is no. And again, there's very little evidence. I can infer from later evidence, and things changed by the 19th century. So for instance, in Curacao and Suriname, it was very common that these mixed race individuals would be, that the fathers would acknowledge paternity. They would acknowledge, yes, this is my child, this is my son or daughter or whatever. They would often free the child because, of course, the child was born into slavery if the mother was a slave. But they would often free the children of the mothers with whom they had relations or sex. They would often, in some cases, they would include the kid in the family. In some cases, the kids would take on the family names. But in Curacao, and please Ron and Renee correct me if I'm wrong, in Curacao, they would almost always give the children a name that had some difference to it. So the name was quite close to the family name, but not identical. I see. So Renee, so maybe that's not totally correct. Again, I think in the 19th century, things changed drastically. The 19th century is really a different world, different atmosphere. There are cases where the mixed race people get involved with the family business, but from what I remember, it's always the local business. I don't remember them being involved in the overseas, the traveling part, the shipping part of it. But I don't know. We have to also keep in mind that urban slaves, right? So a lot of these merchants, most of these Sephardic Jews were even the merchants, they were not planters. They didn't own plantations. They didn't run plantations. They were urban merchants, and urban merchants used slaves in their, domestically and in their businesses, but most urban merchants would own, 1, 2, 3, 4 slaves. It wasn't like industrial size slavery. So the slaves, yes, they were very involved with unloading the ships, maintaining the warehouses. They were probably involved in other aspects of the businesses. I know that in Suriname, there's even a case of a mixed race woman who inherits the family money, but that's much later. That's the late 18th century. So again, there's a lot of nuances here.
Okay. Can I jump in here for a moment, if possible? Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes,
Hi.
go ahead.
Evan, hi. A couple of points. If you look at the 16th century, 17th century documents in England about the Portuguese, the women are talked about as amazingly beautiful. In fact, you wonder why, you now understand why Cromwell let us back in. I mean, they all rave about it, seriously. Pereira went to Venice 50 years earlier and raved about the beauty of the Portuguese women. In fact, he immediately got hung, drawn, and quartered by the people in the synagogue there, for eyeing them up too much. But jumping to Curacao now, I spent a lot of time transcribing all the records for Curacao and Suriname. And I had a happy time reading Emmanuel's famous genealogy history thing, the masterpiece. And he put a famous comment in it, which I was really annoying. And all these families were white. Now, I kept half those families, and there's no way that they were white. He was making a very big thing, and this was only 50 years ago. It wasn't Victorian times.
Yeah, but again, that's why I think, first of all, if you've transcribed all this stuff, I would love to see it. Hopefully it's digitized. That's amazing. What a feat.
I've done Suriname. I can't do Curacao because of what he wrote is rubbish, a lot of it.
Right.
I'm waiting for Hague to give me the transcribed records, which they'll be doing next year. And then I'll transcribe. But you're welcome to Suriname.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I have to say that, this question of color, the terms themselves, you can't take them in a biophysical sense. The terms are overwhelmingly what I would call socially constructed, right? White does not, anyway, we're not white. I'm not white. I'm peach. I'm like flesh color. I'm some, form of like pinkish,
All over the world, the ancient world.
So none of this has to do with objective, visual phenomena. Whiteness is a social status. Whiteness is a political status. Whiteness is a form of superiority. Whiteness is a mode by which Europeans who came to the Americas as Scots or Irish or Huguenot or Dutch become white. They become something superior to those other people, the Indians and the blacks. We know that in the Spanish territories, for instance, in Mexico, we know that people were given certificates of whiteness. Why? Because they, wanted to show that they were of a higher class than they might have been socially assigned to. Whiteness was often a question of culture. If you keep your house neat, if you dress nicely, if you're not like a poor slob, you're white. So whiteness is a really pliable thing.
Are you aware?
Just like blackness is,
Are you aware the same things still apply in India, for example? The most beautiful Indians are the most white Indians. That's not me talking, that's my friends in India.
India, the subcontinent, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. This is, but the Emmanuel, so in other words, when Emmanuel is writing that, when Isaac Emmanuel is writing that in the 50s, what he's essentially saying is, we fit in, we belong to the good, the upper, better part of society.
Yeah, very much so. What called him out, though, is he kept linking the families back to Amsterdam. So you're looking and thinking, this isn't right. This family definitely did not go to Suriname, which got me, researching the whole lot. But it's very much, his books are purely about, we are pure white, we are aristocratic from Amsterdam, from Europe.
Exactly. Listen, history and scholarship undergoes its own transformations, obviously. And, it's only in the mid 20th century, that you start having people paying attention It's even only in the early 20th century that people start writing about the working class, about the proletariat or about women. These were groups that were completely ignored and overlooked. History traditionally was a history of generals and leaders and heroic men, Carlyle, etc. So, it's only in the, and sometimes it's not even out of racism, sometimes it's just out of kind of inertia. And no one thought to look at any of this stuff. So Moshe de Mesquita is a great example. It would have never occurred to me to think of him as a mixed race person had I not been sort of attuned to all of this and started thinking, yeah, wait, what about the other half of the family? Who were they? Who were they? What happened to them?
But for people listening, the best story I had, you may not have heard of Mary Seacole, Britain's greatest black citizen. Mary Seacole, half caste, Jamaica. She became famous by going to the Crimean War and helping our soldiers who were injured. The truth of the story is, well, we're working it. She was part of the Henriquez family. The mother sent her to England when she was 18. She stayed in a family home for a year. Now, this is the child of an ex-half-caste slave, Netto. She allowed from the family home for a year in the best part of London. They paid her. She then does amazing stuff in Crimea all over the world. Her sort of cousin, maybe, was one of the founders of alternate medicine, the Henriquez. So, but can I prove it? No, but it is that mixture. Come on. The daughter of an ex-slave and a Scotsman, suddenly being paid to come to London, doing the best house, etc.
Right. Yeah. Listen, this is Laura Liebman's new book, that was mentioned in the chat before, which I haven't read yet. But again, that's the 19th century. And the 19th century is, as I said, a different world. But listen, in the colonial period, Irish in the United States, the Irish were called black, when W.E.B. Du Bois goes, the great black sociologist and writer and thinker, when he goes to Poland and he meets Jews, he says, "Oh, wow, you're black too." I mean, so it's all, yeah.
Yes.
But listen, we know that socially constructed phenomena may have, on one level, no existence, but on the other hand, they are absolutely real. And race is a perfect example of it. It's a perfect example of something that's non-existent that has had an absolutely enormous impact on our world.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Kevin, for your question. I would like to end the meeting with one last question that Howard posed. When do you plan to write about Moses Bueno de Mesquita?
If I say as soon as possible, it won't be wrong. It won't be false. But I don't know. I need what I need is a year of not teaching. I need a year to sit and someone to give me a fellowship so I can just do research, because I have too many other projects. This essay that you've been kind enough to hear me deliver in a haphazard oral fashion is what I'm trying to finish up next. And then when I finish that up, I will release a book of this essay and two other essays, and they're all on 17th century Sephardic merchants and travelers. And what I want to do is release that book with, I want to include the original versions, because each chapter of the book, so I'll have 3 chapters. Here's my email for anyone who wants to write me. So the book will have 3 chapters. And again, as I said, each is devoted to a particular Sephardic traveler and merchant and colonist in certain respects in the 17th century. And I want to include the original texts because each chapter is based on a specific, on a travel report. Right, Moshe de Paiva Pereira, who went to India and then became a diamond merchant. He writes a travel report on Cochin, the Jews of Cochin, in 1685. The very famous Antonio de Montesinos, right, who writes this report on his coming across one of the lost 10 tribes in what's now present-day Colombia, that Menashe ben Israel puts at the beginning of his text, Esperanza de Israel, Mikveh Israel. And I want to include the original text in, and then translations into English, which I think will be very useful for people.
Yeah.
And then I can think about getting to this Moshe Mesquita. And then I need Ton to find some documents for me first, because he is so skilled at finding and understanding some of these documents. So it's been
Thank you.
a very fruitful partnership for me. So thank you
you.
all once more. Really, I
Yeah.
appreciate your
I
great
do have
audience.
some
I
more
really
information
appreciate you
about
coming.
this Moses Paiva de Pereira. So he was a son of Abraham Esau Pereira.
Thank you. Thank you.
We
The
would
Sephardic Sherlock Holmes, exactly.
too much honor. So with this positive note, I would like to end the meeting. Thank you all for watching, for a lively discussion. Thanks above all to Jonathan for a very interesting and lively presentation. We are really thankful that you have agreed to talk to Sephardic World. And we are also grateful to our patrons who make all of this possible. We say goodbye to our viewers on YouTube. And we hope to see you all next week. We do have a speaker, but we have to confirm him yet. So more details will follow later this week. So once again, thank you, Jonathan. And thank you all.